Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our creation panel. Starting off tonight, we'll have Dr. Marti Steussy from Christian Theological Seminary do a presentation of Genesis 2 through 3, the Eden account of creation. Dr. Steussy has taught for 25 years at Christian Theological Seminary. She holds a PhD from Vanderbilt Divinity School. Among her claim to fame is that she has published 2 science fiction novels, besides work on the Hebrew Bible. So please welcome Dr. Steussy.
Okay, I'm going to tell you the story of Eden today. Something we often forget about the Bible is that in biblical times people didn't read silently. The normal assumption when something was written down was that this would be a resource for telling it aloud to an audience, and even if you were reading by yourself, you did it out loud. They thought there was something wrong with you if you read without moving your lips. And a consequence of hearing a story told out loud is you realize the storytellers have tones of voice. We're so accustomed to hearing these read in church in a kind of sacred monotone. That is a tone of voice, and it does communicate something about the story. But one can pick out the voices of different storytellers. So in the 7-day story at the beginning of Genesis, you get a wonderful liturgical voice. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz v'ha'aretz hayeta tohu v'vohu v'ruach Elohim mirachet al pnei hayom. And it concludes in the beginning of chapter 2, on the 7th day, v'yachulu hashamayim v'ha'aretz. And you probably didn't notice, but that story always talks about the skies and the earth in that order. The next story is really interested in earth and what happens on earth. The first one comes from somebody very careful. There's 7 times that certain words appear, and 3 times that certain other words appear, and 10 times that it's all counted up and orderly and systematic, and God is in control. The second part, this Genesis 2:4b through the end of chapter 3 thing, is from a storyteller who loves puns. So the Adam is made from the Adamah, the human from the humus. You could do the same pun in English. And we think of it as the story of the fall, usually, capital F. But if you listen to it, there's a whole lot in the second story, I told you it focuses on earth, about putting food on the table. And so I'm going to invite you to listen for all the ways that this story talks about agriculture and work. And you can imagine the storyteller looking at the animals and saying, you know, they just kind of eat what they can find, and they have sex, and they have babies, and it doesn't, how did life get to be so complicated for us? And yet, once you've discovered clothes, I, for one, am not eager to go outside this evening without mine. Human civilization has its advantages, too. So, the naming thing, click, starts already. I'm going to call this the story of the Orchard of Delight. Eden is a word that means delight. But more importantly, if we hear the word garden, then most of us think grubbing around in the dirt and digging. If you've ever used a calorie tracking app, gardening gets, it's hard work. Listen carefully. The whole point of this story is they didn't have to dig when they were in Eden. They could eat the fruit off the trees. It's when they get cast out that they have to till the soil. So I'm going to tell this story in my own translation to bring out some of the nuances of the Hebrew. You are welcome to ask when I get done about anything that you're curious about. Click. This picture was taken, you can see how dry the desert is in the background. This is down in the Sinai, and my guide happened to have been an Israeli agricultural agent working with the local Bedouin tribe. So he takes us on this walk through a wadi, and you can see how hot and dry and dusty it was. And right up there, you can see the glint of water. He helped them dig a well. And that's why that green patch in the center, it had apples and pears and figs and pomegranates and oranges and lemons and limes and aspen trees to make tent poles for the Bedouin tents. Now, the only problem with a garden like this is you can imagine every animal for kilometers around showing up to feast on the greenery, which is why you can see right there, there's a stone wall around the whole thing. So we're walking through the dry, dusty wadi, and we come around the corner and see this. And I froze in my tracks, and I said, I know the Hebrew word for that. It's gone. The one that I'm going to translate orchard, because it's full of trees with fruit. But sometimes I translate park, because it's full of animals too. The humans are park rangers. And I said, and I know the Persian word for that. They called it a paradis, from which the Greeks got their word paradisos. So, click. If you ever wanted to know what paradise looks like, here you go. Okay, click. This, by contrast, is the kind of land that the Israelites were farming. You can see it's limestone, it's layered, it has strata, and the layers have been enhanced by hand labor, picking up rocks, building walls at the edge of the terraces, filling in with dirt behind them. You can see that those terraces are not really wide enough that you would plow with a team of oxen. It was only if you were really rich and had a field in the valley that you would have oxen. Poor people did it mostly with a stick, and maybe with a donkey. But you can see, and the point is there's not very much rain. So when it does rain in the winter, you want the water to catch behind those walls and soak into the terraces, and that's what you grow your grain crop on. And you can just imagine how much work that was. Contrasted to, couldn't they just be like the animal, and eat fruit? How lovely if you could just eat fruit off the fruit. So you're going to hear references in the story to eating bread and eating the grass of the field. Remember that wheat and barley are members of the grass family. Okay? So when they talk about eating the grass of the field or eating bread, that's a contrast with eating fruit. That's eating the kind of stuff you grow on this sort of thing. Okay, click. In this story, God is called by name. Because I work in a lot of interfaith settings, I don't like to use the name. And at the same time, I want you to hear that it is a name and not a title. So I'm going to say Jehovah, which is a medieval Christian mangling of the name. It's not how it was ever pronounced, and that's why I feel comfortable saying it. So just that word there in vocabulary. On the day when Jehovah God made earth and sky, when no bush of the countryside was yet on the earth, and no grass of the countryside had yet sprung up, because Jehovah God had not made it rain on the earth. And there was no human to serve the humus, but a mist came up from the earth and watered the whole face of the humus? On that day, Jehovah God formed a human. Dust from the humus, and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living being. Then Jehovah God planted an orchard in Delight, which is in the east, and therein put the human that he had formed. And from the humus Jehovah God made spring every kind of tree, pleasant to look at and good for food. And in the middle of the orchard, the tree of life and the tree of knowing right and wrong. Now, a river went out from Delight to water the orchard, and from there it divided and became 4 headwaters. The name of the first was Pishon. It's the one that goes around the whole land of Havilah where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. Amber and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It's the one that goes around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It runs east of Assyria. And the fourth river, that's the Euphrates. So, Jehovah God took the human that he had formed and settled it in the orchard of Delight to serve it and guard it. And Jehovah God commanded the human, saying, from any tree of the orchard you may eat, yes, eat, but from the tree of knowing right and wrong, you must not eat from that one, because on the day you eat from it, you die. Yes, you die. And then Jehovah God said, it's not good for the human to be alone. I'll make it a rescuer matched to it. So, from the humus, Jehovah God formed every animal of the countryside and the birds of the air. He brought each one to the human to see what it would call it. And whatever the human called each living being, that is its name. So the human called names for all the livestock and the birds of the sky and the animals of the countryside. But for human, a rescuer matched to it was not found. So, Jehovah God made a trance fall on the human, and while it slept, he took one of its ribs and closed up the place with flesh, and Jehovah God built the rib that he had taken from the human into a woman. And brought her to the human. The human said, this, at last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, because from a man she was taken, this one. That's why a man abandons his father and his mother and clings to his woman, and they become one flesh. and they were nude, both of them, the human and his woman. They were not ashamed. Now, the snake was more shrewd than any other animal of the countryside that Jehovah God had made. It said to the woman, "Did God really say you can't eat from any tree of the orchard?" The woman said to the snake, "Of the fruit of the orchard's trees we may eat, but of the tree that is in the middle of the orchard," God said, "don't eat from that one. Don't even touch it, lest you die." The snake said to the woman, "You won't die." "No, won't die." God knows that on the day of you all's eating from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become godlike, knowing right and wrong. Well, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes and desirable to make one wise. So she took some of its fruit and ate, and gave some to her man who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were nude. So they sewed fig leaves and made loincloths for themselves. And then they heard the sound of Jehovah God walking in the orchard for the day's breeze. So the human hid himself, his woman too, in the middle of the orchard's trees from the presence of Jehovah God. Jehovah God called to the human. He said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of you walking in the orchard, and I was scared because I'm nude. So I hid myself." He said, "Who told you that you're nude? That tree that I commanded you not to eat from it, did you eat from it?" The man said, "The woman that you gave to be with me, she gave me some of the fruit from the tree, and I ate." To the woman, God said, "What's this you've done?" The woman said, "The snake tricked me, and I ate." To the snake, Jehovah God said, "Because you have done this, cursed are you more than any livestock or animal of the countryside. On your belly you'll go. Dust you'll eat all the days of your life. And I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. It'll bruise you on the head, and you'll bruise it on the heel." To the woman he said, "I'll multiply, yes, multiply your hard work and your conceptions. Along with manual labor, you'll bear children. And yet, your desire will be for your man, and he'll dominate you." To human, he said, "Because you obeyed the voice of your woman and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, don't eat from it. Cursed is the humus on your account. With hard work you'll eat of it all the days of your life. It will make thorns and thistles sprout forth for you, and you'll eat the grass of the countryside. By the sweat of your face you'll eat bread until you are returning to the humus, for from it you were taken. Dust you are. To dust you'll return. The human called his woman's name Life, because she became the mother of all living. And Jehovah God made for human and his woman tunics of skin and clothed them. Then Jehovah God said, look, the humans become like one of us, knowing right and wrong. Now, lest they reach forth their hands and take also from the tree of life, and eat and live forever. So, Jehovah God sent him away from the orchard of delight to serve the humus from which she had been taken. He exiled humankind, and east of the orchard of delight, God posted the great winged sphinxes and the fiery, flashing sword to guard the way to the tree of life.
Thank you, Dr. Steussy. James, I'm going to hand on this side. Sorry,
I wanted to stay close to the sword.
you want to stay close to the sword? I'd like to introduce the rest of our panelists right now, and then we'll get right into our discussion. So, starting on this far side is Dr. John Noble. His PhD is from Harbin Divinity School, and he is Assistant Professor of Bible and Religion at Huntington University, north of here. He's also the Director of the Center for Non-Western Studies. Welcome. And next to John is Dr. Michael Harbin. He has taught for 25 years at Taylor University and is still there. He is the chair of the Department of Biblical Studies, Christian Ministries, and Philosophy. His doctoral degree is from Dallas Theological Seminary. Welcome, everyone. And then on the far side here is Dr. James McGrath. His doctoral degree is from Durham University in England. He holds the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair of New Testament Language and Literature at Butler University, so he is our near neighbor. When I first got here in 2010, Dr. McGrath was very hospitable to me, and I spent a wonderful afternoon at Butler with him. He is also director of their core curriculum right now as well. So I want to welcome our guests. And we're going to start with a round of, I'm going to ask them a question, have them each give a brief response. Pretty soon we're going to ask for questions from the audience, so we want you to be thinking of questions as well. So we just heard the story of the Garden of Eden. I'd like each of you please to give us in a nutshell what you would say to your students about what this story meant, how it sounded to its first audience back in the day. So back in Israel when it was written, or wherever it was written, how did it sound? So I guess let's just start. If we just start in the same order, let's just go across. So we'll go Dr. Noble, Dr. Harbin, Dr. Steussy, and Dr. McGrath. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. And thank you for your performance, Dr. Steussy. That was really wonderful and fascinating. And it's amazing the kinds of things you can learn about the story from hearing it performed the way you have. Thank you very much. So one of the things I tell my students is that as we read these stories, they can be read. Is this on?
No.
Did you turn it?
Maybe that's a problem. Is that better?
Uh-huh.
Well, anyway, earlier I was thanking Dr. Steussy, and that was very helpful. Thank you. One of the things I like to tell my students is that as we read texts, sacred texts, we read them from the perspective of 21st century, most of us 21st century Westerners. We have certain perspectives and backgrounds that we bring to the text, and so that informs the way we understand and experience these things. There are multiple ways to read these stories. Not all of the ways to read these stories are as good as the others. In the humanities, and religion is part of the humanities. In the humanities, we're looking for ways of reading, we're looking for theories of interpretation that have explanatory power, that are able to account for the data as best as possible. And so anyway, different readings can account for data in different ways. Long story short, one of the ways I like to read Genesis chapters 2 and 3 really is in sort of dialogue with Genesis chapter 1. And at the end of Genesis chapter 1, we get this statement, this wonderful statement, that God has created humanity in His image, according to His likeness. It says, male and female, He's made them in His image. Right? One way to read Genesis 2 and 3, then, I like to share with students, is you can read it as a kind of commentary on what it means to be in the image of God. Right? So Dr. Steussy talked about the trees. We got to hear about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She was pointing her finger around her head. And also the tree of life. These are the two trees that really are featured or described in Genesis 2, in the garden or in the park, the orchard, whatever you want to call it. And the man and the woman have access in the first place to the tree of life, but they don't have access to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the commandment that's given to them. Once they take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then they're blocked by this big, sharp, long, pointed sword from the tree of life. So, in the first place, they have access to life, but not knowledge of good and evil. Then they take from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they're blocked from access to the tree of life. What does this have to do with the image of God? Well, we can read these as divine attributes, immortality or life on the one hand, or knowledge and self-awareness, consciousness, the thing that separates us from the animals. We were having an interesting conversation earlier with your professor about what it means to be separate from the animals. So, in what sense are we in the image of God? Well, we're not divine. Psalm 8 says that God made us a little bit lower than the angel, or a little bit lower than divine. We're not divine, but we participate somehow in divinity. We have access to life or knowledge. Not both simultaneously. One reason why I like that reading is because when we come to Colossians in the New Testament, Paul says that in Christ the fullness of God is pleased to dwell. And you have in Christ both mentality, both life and awareness, both sort of the full range of humanity and the full range of divinity simultaneously.
I'm an Old Testament guy, and my background really is in engineering. I kind of take things in a straightforward manner. And As I read through this, it strikes me, building on what Dr. Noble said, that as we look at this text, it strikes me that Genesis 2, the account here, is really building on the account we didn't cover, Genesis 1. And I'm very struck by, in Genesis 1, mankind collectively, men and women, are given a command to manage the world. And I think in Genesis 2, we're given a picture here that not only is this a collective command, but it pictures a unique role for each individual. And the picture I see here of Adam, the man, the human, the Isha, or the Ish, and then followed by the Isha, individually having different roles that complement each other. And so in the first picture I see is that we have a group that perfectly complements each other to do this management. And then I see, as we continue into the story, the breakdown of that structure. And so I see the layout here, and I take it as a theological statement that the individuals who would be hearing this for the first time are recognizing we're in this mess because of what we see here. And then we have also, though, in there this very subtle hint of something that's going to be developing as a flood as you get towards the New Testament, and that is the process that God is going to use to correct this, pointing towards that, what we call the Messiah.
I think I've had my chance. So, just a comment, and I love Genesis. I love the 7-day story too. But it talks about us being made in the image of God, and I think perhaps today the most important point to grab about that is that that statement stands in parallel to having dominion. And people have mistaken that as saying that the whole heavens and the earth were created for our benefit and that we can do anything we want with them. Well, no, because it's dominion in the image of God. And God in that story is one who sets things up so that all the parts of the creation can flourish and multiply. And when we do things, the story has a real sense of biodiversity, even though it doesn't use that word. The Eden story is a different tone of voice. And by the way, I think that the storyteller who gives us Genesis 1 is the one who sets the Eden story alongside it. And that storyteller cannot have been, as careful as he is about counting the number of times different words appear and stuff like that, he cannot have missed the fact that the second story is a different number of days and creation in a different order. It's a different sense of things. One way to read the second story, did you notice the emphasis on the gold, and the food, and the work, and the threats and the prohibitions? In a way, it paints God making, with hands from the clay and walking around to enjoy the breeze. If the first story talks about us in God's image, the second one playfully talks about God in a human image. And I take the story with absolute seriousness, and I think it comments on stuff that's really real in the world. But to take it with absolute seriousness is not the same as saying it's exactly the same kind of story as the first one in my read.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to highlight, because it's the sort of thing that I highlight to my students when I teach this class, or when I teach a class in which we engage with the creation stories. Did you notice the way that Dr. Steussy translated what we usually have in our English translation of the Bible as Adam, but Adam was not a name in Hebrew, it was the word for human being. And I often wonder whether certain interpretations that English speakers sometimes gravitate towards would come as naturally if it was rendered as human with a capital H as opposed to as this name. I also ask students, who walks around naked but is unashamed? And I'm always a little worried they're going to say my roommate or something like that. But of course, one possible answer is children. And then I ask students another question. When did you first realize you were naked? Not when did you first have that dream you're walking down the street naked, right? You might remember that, right? But do you remember the first moment when you thought, you're like, oh wow, I'm naked? And so one way that some modern people gravitate towards reading this story is as about those two people back then who got us into this mess. Right? Which I think is interesting because the story ends by pointing to our human tendency to shift blame onto other people and suggests that's not a good thing. And yet that's one of the very popular ways of reading this story. Right? If we read it as about human, capital H, right? About this experience that all human beings go through, then instead of being this thing that people will debate about, is this thing really what happened back then, and then what do I do with all this evidence from science and other things, it becomes a story that's about the way we are, and the way we experience ourselves today. An experience that we share with ancient people who created stories like this and told stories like this, precisely to explore those aspects of life that are lost in the mists of our earliest childhood memories, or before our earliest childhood memories, and so we don't have clarity about them. And that's what storytelling of this sort, in symbols and in pictures and in prototypes, I think is all about.
Thank you. We want to get the audience involved soon, so do you have any questions right now? Dr. Benson?
I guess I would be interested in hearing you all react to each other's comments, initial comments. Sort of going back through and seeing what you thought about each other's comments and building off of those, perhaps.
Okay, let's go for it. Reactions to each other. We're all friends.
Mostly, I think I would just shake my head and say yes, and that sounds right. I agree. I think there are different ways of understanding and different points of emphasizing. I think we could spend the whole semester, the whole year, really talking about this part of the Bible, really Genesis 1, 2, and 3, if we wanted to. We could easily fill this space. I appreciate what you said about the wordplay, right, in Genesis 2 and 3. And you mentioned Adam being derived from the noun for ground, which is Adamah. So one scholar I know prefers to translate Adam as Claude. That's his name, he's Claude. Or human with a capital H is another nice way to put it. Yeah. Another word play in this section of Genesis is regards the words for shrewd and for naked. We've been talking about shrewd and nude is even better. That's right. Shrewd and nude. It's a good way to remember. Is a room and a rome in Hebrew, but they have the same consonants, right? So Aleph, Resh, Mem, and so we put them together. The snake is shrewd. The snake is also naked. The reptile doesn't have hair, so both apply to the snake. The man and the woman are naked in the first place, but then they gain knowledge and they become like the snake, shrewd also. So there's a lot of wordplay, and I think probably several others we could describe. Pass it on.
I would in general agree. I make one observation of Dr. Steussy is that I really like the idea that, as you pointed out, dominion can be so misused. And I like the idea of manage. And I think the terminology there, as used elsewhere throughout the Old Testament, points towards wise management of the world. And sometimes I tell my students, how would you like to have a business card that said, World Manager? Nice title.
I feel like we're all saying, yeah, we all agree with each other. I'm trying to think if there's anything I could say that could get us, hopefully not end our friendship before the evening is over, but push us off in a different direction. But you mentioned how things move into the New Testament, and of course that's actually my area. And I think it's interesting to think because I'm not sure to what extent these sorts of views are represented in the audience today, but certainly you've probably all intersected with people who emphasize in one form or another the need to deny certain aspects of modern science because of purportedly things that are in these stories. And oftentimes it's not the stories in Genesis themselves, but those stories viewed through things that Paul says and that other New Testament authors say about Adam, and the way Adam and Jesus are related to one another there. And so I think it's useful to think as well about the question, did Jesus take this Genesis story literally in the sense that some modern interpreters do? Did Paul take the story literally in the way that some modern interpreters do? Right? Because there is a sort of a literalism there in the sense that ancient authors shared a lot of assumptions about what the cosmos is like, what human beings are like, that we may not share. But if we're thinking about literalism in the modern sense, then I think it's worth noting what Paul says, right? Paul says, right, through one man, sin entered the world. Is that the story Dr. Steussy just read? No. It's two human beings, or what? Why does Paul say one man? Well, because what he's really interested in is the one man, Jesus, and setting up a contract. Right? And it worked. But it's not literalism. Right? It's not an accurate description of that. And when we look at what Jesus says about, relating it to questions about divorce, right? For this reason, right, a human being, right, a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. He was aware that it's actually, what the story is really about is this experience that human beings have of finding this other person and experiencing it as being like finding your other half. It's a story about two becoming one. It says as much in Genesis. The story literally depicts one becoming two. But what it's about, and Jesus seems to recognize this in his interpretation of it, is this, again, a universal human experience, of which this is, I think, a picture. And so I think it's interesting to bring the New Testament in relation to literalism, because I think there are a lot of people who have the impression that, well, Genesis might not on its own allow us to move in this direction, but Paul does. And actually, I think the New Testament actually complicates things in interesting ways that are sometimes neglected in those kinds of interpretations. And I don't know whether that's until you start asking us questions, we won't figure out whether anything that we're talking about is of any interest to you whatsoever. And so hopefully you'll start moving us in a direction that will engage the kinds of things that you're hoping we'll talk about.
Okay, we have a question from Peter Swindman.
So it calls the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I was intrigued by the word knowledge here. Is it like talking more about an experiential form of knowledge where now they know what it means to not be fully human?
I would say it's a all-purpose Hebrew word for know that ranges as wide as the English word know does. I mean, sometimes they refer to sex as knowing someone else. This is the same word. But it's also, I don't know what to do next. I need to know how to fight this war. It's just all over the place.
Robbie.
Yeah, I think Dr. Harbin mentioned something about like the sharing of the role to guard or manage the garden. And I just, in reading the scriptures, I think I have heard you could think of it as Adam was first given the role of managing, and he helped teach Eve that, and then before Eve came along, he wasn't very connected with creation. Like it says, like none of the animals were a good fit for him, and then like she at last was like his connection with creation, and then like maybe that's where like those two rules, that's where they failed. He failed to like help her guard the garden against the snake, and then she failed to help him connect with the threat that was coming from within creation. Is that like, I guess I'm kind of wondering, is that an idea that's in scripture scholarship that you've heard? And how would you react to like the question of to what degree did the fall distort or damage the original rules of these two beings in the Garden of Eden? And if anyone can answer that.
Well, that's an excellent question. When I talk about the management, I'm drawing really from the Genesis 1 account where it talks about gave them dominion or management over the entire, both male and female. And so I see that as a composite. If we have a complementary, as Dr. Steussy suggests, where the chapter 2 complements chapter 1 in terms of the creation, then it's going to amplify that. And so some of those nuances, it's hard to say how they work out. I mean, what you read there in the text is that the man names the animals before the Isha is created. So you got that interesting dynamic. In terms of the relationships, I would argue that we're seeing a breakdown of of all human relationships. The first one is the breakdown of the Ish and Isha with God. They're now separated from God. They're hiding from God. They're ashamed. They recognize. And I'm going to argue that I would prefer in here, I know the wordplay is better in English with nude, but the word naked carries certain connotations in English that we miss with nudity. Nudity is kind of morally neutral. Nakedness is vulnerable. You've got some aspects there that I think would show it better. So you have the breakdown the relationship of God, and you have, as you so wonderfully displayed, the blame that they placed on each other. Adam pointing to God and said, the woman you gave me, she, and then you have that dynamic. And then that whole dynamic of her desire will be for her husband. And the phrase there, it's used only, well, one other time, it's in the next chapter, and you have the whole dynamic of Cain being told sin is crouching at the door, and it's a desire. The same word is for you, and you must stand against it. And I would like to do something here. I would suggest that as we look at this breakdown of the relationship between the Ish and the Isha, you've got this all-purpose conjunction we call a vav there, usually translated and, but I like to translate it as a but here. Your desire is going to be for your husband, but he's going to have dominion over you. And so I don't see this as a command that God's given, but he's recognizing that because of the differences in the two genders, the two persons, two sexes, there's going to be competition. The third area I see of a breakdown relationship is with the environment. We see that and are cast out, and we have thorns, thistles, we have them laboring for life. And then the last relationship actually is an internal relationship. I think we can, as we see that vulnerability, that nakedness again, I would argue that this might suggest psychological problems. And so I see multiple dimensions of breakdown of relationships in there.
I'm having a yes but reaction, which is very typical of me. I'm famous for saying on the one hand and on the other. I want to start by saying, and others have already said this story has a life. It's not just one thing at one point in time. It is a vine that has grown through thousands of years, and the questions we ask of it and the fruit we pick from the vine at different points. What Paul picks from the vine, what some of the other New Testament writers pick from the vine are not the same thing. What Milton gets from it and what are not always the same thing. So on the one hand, I think part of why we got what we did in Scripture, that process of canonization, has to do with the richness of stories that can travel through time with a community, with multiple communities, and each of those communities finds these really rich places to go. I mean, if it were all just written out flat and clear like a creed, so everything was unmistakable, it would have outdated millennia ago. But there is this room for it to be vibrant and alive to grow with us. At the same time, the danger is, I'm not sure that the storyteller we were starting with even saw this as religious teaching. What if how many stories have you heard that begin with, and they told him, you can go into any room of the castle except the one with the purple door. What's the story going to be about? It's the room with the... And that's not necessarily even a big moral thing, it's just part of the genre. If we heard this story with different names and it wasn't so familiar, we might think it was funny when God says, well, this human that I made, he needs a companion, and proceeds to make all these wild animals and domestic animals and birds, and keeps bringing to the human who keeps saying, nah, not that one either. We're schooled not to read it that way, but I think that might be in it. And a fascinating question for me is, and again, I want to say, I think it's okay to try lots of different ways of reading it. So I don't want to rule out other ways of reading it. But we do have a tendency to find what we already know when we come in and read it very seriously as religious teaching. We assume there is a fall. We make lots of assumptions like that. And I wonder what it means if we say, this is part of the Bible, this is part of our tradition. I'm even willing to say that God had something to do with us getting it as part of our tradition. But what if God thought a playful story that meditates on the way humans behave and the way things happen in this world without it being a matter of heavy judgment and the entrance of death into the entire biological realm for the rest of the history of the universe? What might it say for God if we didn't insist on reading it in quite the heavy genre that we usually do?
Yeah, just following up on that, it reminds me of there's a clip, I can't remember where I saw it, it was definitely sort of British comedy, but it was about somebody who had found the missing lost preface to Genesis, which said, I dedicate this to my darling Elizabeth and things like that, but then also added, this is a work of fiction, any resemblance to any actual persons living or dead is entirely coincidental and things like that, and of course it was an attempt at comedy. But I think there's a serious side, which is that before we get to in the beginning, or before we get to Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, we're shaped by certain assumptions about what it is that we're reading and how we're supposed to approach it. If I were to ask you, if you find a random story that features a talking animal, what genre would you put that story into? Right? Without anyone having to tell you, without it having to come with either a Library of Congress or Dewey Decimal marking on the side, you'd probably know. If I ask you, is this story in that genre, you might say no. But why? And it's probably because you've been told that all other stories that feature talking animals go into this genre. This one, though, you should read differently. And we can talk about whether that's an appropriate assumption or not, but it's not something that the text itself tells you, that this is a different category of story, and that you as a reader or you as a hearer of the story should put everything you know about literature on hold, and everything you know about stories and their genres on hold, and treat this one entirely differently. And so I think that's at least worth making ourselves aware of consciously and thinking about.
I'm going to jump in and name a theological issue here that's really important when you're looking at biology. And that's the assumption that somehow the world was made as and should have continued to be a place with no pain, no change, and no death. In both of these stories, the world is created vegetarian, so far as we can tell. Permission to eat meat doesn't come until later. But my best read of biology is that vegetarianism ended long before humans came on the scene. Showing that I agree more with the chronology of the 7-day story than with the second one where the human is there first, before all the other animals. But, you know, arguably, in any world where there's change and growth, there's loss that comes with that. Even if it's happy change. I cry at graduations. Now, it's not that graduations aren't good things. I should tell you, graduations are good things. And yet something is being lost when the graduation happens. And in one sense, this story is about humankind gaining something that most of the rest of the Bible really thinks we should have, that being the knowledge of right and wrong. And yet there's a cost to it. There's a cost to it. Being naked isn't just a matter of innocent delight anymore. So it's a reflection on a complicated world. But I just want to name how that assumption that there should not, that if creation had gone right, there would not be any suffering or death in it, as something that's a very characteristic way that humans like to think about how the world should be by projecting an idealized image back. But the danger of that is it can make us hate what's real. And if the world should have been perfect, then if it's not perfect now, blame has got to be assigned. This story doesn't seem as interested in assigning blame as trying to mend the hurt. I mean, there are punishments, and yet God makes clothes. So that's kind of a deep-seated thing to think about. If you want a serious challenge to how you do biology and relate it to our theological categories, that's a thing that's different.
I would pick up on that a little bit there. Several nuances that I agree with you, like you, the yes, but. One of the questions that I have to ask is that when the animals are brought to Aish, the man, in chapter 2, they seem to be labeled as the beasts of the field. And there are some scholars who suggest that we're not talking about the domesticated kinds, which raises an interesting question. Pardon?
The behemoth are there too.
Yeah, but it raises some very interesting questions there, and I just kind of leave that as an open question. But one of the interesting things that I'm working on in studying is we tie this into the overall structure of the book of Genesis as whoever wrote it. There is a very interesting phrase at the beginning of chapter 2, verse 4, actually, Yela Toldot, and often translated as, well, the King James, the Dewey, the English Standard Version, translated as generations. More modern translations like the NIV, the NASB, translated as account. This is the account of. More recently, a number of Hebrew scholars are suggesting that maybe it should be translated as, this is what became of. And I find that interesting because while it shows up in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, where if you read it in that context, we're told that God created this very good earth, and then in chapter 2, verse 4, it says, here's what became of it. But I find it even more interesting because that verb shows up, or that term, that phrase shows up a number of times through the book, and it seems to become a structural indicator. Chapter 5, verse 1, here's what became of Adam. Chapter 6, verse 9, here's what became of Noah. So you work your way through, finally wrapping up when you get down to the end of the book. Here's what became of Jacob, or Israel, which is the nation. So it would seem to me that the book is constructed in such a way, carefully constructed, with that overall creation account as a preface, so that the people in Israel who are recipients of this would look at that and say, well, here's why we are about. It tells us the nature of the world. Whether it's right or wrong, that's what they would see it as. It tells us, here's our purpose. We are the descendants of Israel, from Jacob. And so I see that kind of as a setting of the pace for those Jewish people several thousand years ago.
Okay, Claire.
Dr. Noble, I think you said this. You said that man was made in the image and likeness of God, and so that doesn't make us divine, but we participate in divinity, and through that is life and knowledge. And I think you said that those can't be simultaneous, and I was just wondering if you could expand on that thought.
Thanks. Well, as a way of reading, thank you for the question. And it took me a minute to recognize who you were, and I saw you stooping down.
They have microphones, so they have to. They're trying to talk to their microphone. That's why they hide from you when they
talk. Very technologically advanced group. Yeah. So, as a way of reading, as a method of reading this story, right, Genesis 2 and 3, and understanding these trees, how are they functioning? What's the point of these trees? That's one way of understanding that the man and the woman are like God, but there's a limit. They are not divine. They're not fully divine, and so they have access. They have partial access to divinity. Right? I don't know if this story has as its purpose to give a full sort of what you might call an anthropological account of what it is to be human in all its facets and aspects. I don't think that's the way we should read, or I don't think that's what we should expect out of these creation stories. Really.
Yeah. Let me share with you one of my favorite interpretations of that phrase, let us make human beings in our image and likeness. I heard this from a Latvian Lutheran pastor who was sure that he got it from somewhere in Jewish tradition, but I've been looking for it and haven't found it anywhere. And so I think it was probably his idea, for better or worse. I'm not persuaded at all that this was in the mind of the author who composed this story, but I still like it and I'm intrigued by it, right? Because one of the things that's long puzzled interpreters is, why does it let us? Right? And of course, later Christians would read the Trinity back in, but I'm thinking, the sort of monotheistic, or however we want to phrase it, ancient Israelite author didn't write let us and then say, oh, well, that must be divinely inspired. I have no idea why that's there, but maybe someone will figure it out later, right? I think they probably understood what they were writing. But if we ask who else is around in the story at that stage, right, other than God, right? If we ask what would an ancient reader have taken away from the story, it's that unlike other creation accounts that they'd heard, in this one there's this one God who creates, speaks and things happen, and there's no conflict, no cosmic soap opera with, all these things going on, that you get another creation account. But if we ask who's around at that phase, there's God and then there's the animals. And so one possible interpretation is, that human beings are in the likeness of God, right? We have these sort of divine-like characteristics, these transcendent aspects of it. But we also have a lot that we share in common with other living things on this planet. And of course, it doesn't mention planet either, right? Because they're not aware of globes and other planets, Mars, and things other than as lights in the sky, perhaps. And so I think, yeah, I'm not persuaded that was in the mind of the author, but I'm intrigued by it, and I think it's an interesting reading. And I thought I'd mention, not least because I know this is a class that has, we're supposed to intersect with your interest in biology in some way, and so I thought I'd throw that out there.
What that really fits with, in both of these stories, we tend to talk about creation and creator, but in both of these stories, creation is a whole bunch of different creatures. And especially in the first one, but also in the second, God is so into delegating. So like, on the first day, God separates light from dark, and then on the fourth day, the heavenly bodies are assigned to separate the light from the dark. And God makes the earth and then says, hey, vegetate forth some plants to the waters, Hey, swarm with some swarming things. So I'm grinning as I hear that story. I don't know that that's what P would have said, but there is a lot of those midrashes, there's a piece of it that fits with some trend that's in the story.
Yeah, thank you so much. I like that. I haven't heard that before. That's a new one for me. I appreciate that. I would like to point out, while I have the microphone here, that the more typical way of understanding the plural here is, well, I guess one more footnote is there's the plural magisterium, the royal we, and you know this, have you heard this before? The Queen says, we are not amused, or use the plural in a sort of self-referential way. I don't think that's what it is either. But the more typical way of understanding that plural there is that God is referring to the divine council. He's talking to other members of his royal court. And you get a picture of this world council, this world court, in other parts of the canon. In 2 Kings, the prophet Micaiah has a vision, and he's in the divine throne room. In Isaiah chapter 6, the call of Isaiah, you get a description of Isaiah in the throne room before the divine council. And Job is the best example. The prologue of Job, where God is holding court in all the divine beings. It doesn't say angels, it says the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, it says, are coming and they're presenting themselves before Yahweh. They're included, interestingly, in Job, at least. In the divine council is Hasatan, the Satan is a member of the divine council, interestingly, there in Job. So that's how I understand it, and that's the way I hear it most often.
Thank you. Much more likely, probably, but I still like that interpretation. You can see why it intrigues me. And
I love it.
It's like, yeah.
Thank you. Well, time keeps on slipping, and we'd like to kind of wrap this up pretty soon. So let me throw out a question for everyone to respond to. We're kind of talking now about what do these creation accounts, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and 3, mean today? How should we read them today? James McGrath mentioned the idea of literalism. Should we read them literally? So talk with us about literalism, science. How do these things affect how we read Genesis 1, Genesis 2 through 3 today?
I can start if you want, but so we're going back to our original order there. I would say that on the one hand, we should read these things literally. Right? There are details in there that I think ancient people would have assumed were literal, right? Such as the dome that's over the earth, right? And things like that. Some of the ways things are depicted. Precisely because I think that helps us get into clearer focus that the ancient author was simply assuming certain things about the cosmic realm and what the world is like. If you read one very well-known Mesopotamian creation story from outside the Bible, the Enuma Elish. If you Google it, Enuma Elish, you can find it online and read excerpts from it. But it talks about the creator god Marduk, is in a Babylonian context, fighting against the sea god, this sea monster Tiamat, who essentially is the Mesopotamian equivalent of Hydra, right, the multi-headed dragon, and says he defeats her, splits her body in half, uses half to make the sky, half to make the sea. And it's very similar to what we get in Genesis in terms of the physical makeup of things, right? Makes a dome, holds up the waters above, and then there's the waters below. There's a splitting of the waters. What's different is not the assumptions about the natural world. It's that there's this one God who speaks, and the will of that one God is realized. It's not through conflict, it's through command. And so it's that theological portrait of the Creator that is what would have jumped out at an ancient reader. And I think for us, sometimes we get caught up in details because they don't match with our own understanding of the universe. But those may be things that simply were at the level of assumptions of an ancient author. And so would they have assumed they were literal? Quite possibly. Does that necessarily mean that we should, for the purpose of constructing our own view of the cosmos? Not necessarily, any more than other things that we treat as metaphors, but ancient people thought were literal, right? And I'll jump to the New Testament, which is again my area. When Paul talks about, the heart as the place where cognition happens, where thinking happens, he was siding with Aristotle, which oftentimes is good to do, but it doesn't always serve you well in the long term, right? Ancient people debated whether the brain or the heart was the place where cognition happened. Paul was coming down on one side of that, but people assumed that it was one or the other and that it was literally. We can treat it as a metaphor, but that doesn't mean that the ancient person did. And so I think it's good to separate what we think ancient people may have assumed as readers, as writers of stories, and whether our own view has to match up with that for some sort of theological or other reason.
There is one other thing that Genesis 1 is doing over against the Babylonian story. In it, humans are created to be servants. And in the Babylonian story. And for perhaps prisoners of war in Babylon to tell a story in which that's not how it happened, it's not a war. The Babylonian king is not the image of God on earth. Instead, there's a God who intends well and blesses everything and intends every human being to be royal. That's a big over against. But to me, today the take home is not necessarily, because we're not telling it over against the Babylonian story. Every human being having dignity is probably worth hanging on to. But for me, the 7-day story is about the deep sacredness and goodness of creation, about a level of awe and wonder at which it's, in spite of what I said a little while ago, a level at which it's all good. That's how God created it, and it still is, and that's important. The story that follows is a meditation on how we don't always experience it that way, and the complicatedness of life, and the wistfulness of ways that we could imagine it could be, but somehow it's not, and the choices we make. It's an invitation to ponder those things. If you have never read Mark Twain's Diary of Adam and Eve, you should. And at the end, it's got all these hysterical lines in it. I mean, it is Mark Twain, and it is really funny. But at the end of the story, Adam is at Eve's grave marker. And he says, where she was, that was Eden.
Building on that, I throw in one more little incident about the Babylonian Enelios. They argue that their gods were created, which is a very interesting comment. But as far as for us today, I agree that we see that the story is that God had made a good creation. I would argue that for the original reader, this would be an explanation of why things were bad, And if that elecomadot structure is correct, I find it very interesting that the very next incident after Genesis 3, but part of the same section by that structure, we have sacrificial worship as a means of coming to God. Now it's very interesting, the sacrifice there is a burnt offering, which is a offering of consecration, not sin offering. But it is interesting that we do seem to see a process of animal sacrifice coming out of that, which raises some very interesting theological questions.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a word in English, the definition of which has been problematic, and people have struggled to try to sort of get their hands around it. And that word is myth. What is a myth? Today we have this television show called Mythbusters. If something's a myth, that means it's false. That's not. I don't think that's really a good definition of myth. Myth is my definition of myth is a sacred story that has explanatory power. It talks about origins of people or culture. And in that sense, I think Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are myth. Right? Not in the sense that they're not true, but they're myth in the sense that they have explanatory power, that they describe for us who we are and how the world is patterned and what kind of a cosmos this is. I like to tell my students that a story can be true with a capital T, even if it isn't true with a lowercase t. And I think that applies. Keeping that in mind helps reading different parts of the Bible. I think there are stories in the Bible that may not be historically grounded that convey truth. And as a person of faith, that means a lot to me. Right? I read a lot out of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 that has spiritual and religious significance for me. That the God of the creation described in Genesis is one who makes us in His image. He does not create humans in order to be slaves, in order to do the dirty work of the gods, right, as we see in New Revelation. I think that has profound value. Hopefully it gives hope.
Dr. Lowry?
The topic of a literal interpretation of the first two chapters really hits home to me. I was raised in a very fundamentalist Protestant upbringing and deeply embedded in the Bible Belt, just south of the Buckle, if you will. I'm better now. Moved around a bit. I'd love to get your impression on, when I was growing up, there was a fear of you had to hold on tightly to a literal interpretation of the creation accounts, otherwise what else could you trust in the Bible? It came down to a question of, well, if the first three chapters you read aren't literal, then how can you be sure anything else you read is? And I would love to hear your impressions of how, as 21st century, well-educated individuals, you respond to that.
Well, I'll just say very briefly, first of all, I'll say I found my way to similar Protestant circles in my teens and to young earth creationism briefly. But I know that because I wasn't raised steeped in it, I think I was able to disentangle myself in my faith and have my faith survive that in a way that sometimes if you're raised steeped in that so that you think that is what Christian faith means, what it actually sets you up to do is, it sets you up with an impression of the Bible that doesn't match what the Bible actually contains and is, and so actually encourages people to lose their faith when they read the Bible honestly. And I think that's deeply disturbing, and the fact that some people think that those who advocate that view are promoters of the Christian faith rather than people who are doing serious damage to it is problematic. But my shorter answer that I probably should have just given without all that preface is that according to the Bible, our trust is not supposed to be in the Bible. Our trust is supposed to be in God. And it's the very desire for certainty, right? The desire to have confidence and not have to throw ourselves entirely on God, because as human beings, we're inevitably uncertain about things, inevitably wrong, that I think that approach to the Bible is actually trying to avoid. And so I think there's something profoundly sinful about it, if you will.
I would like to just share what as we get into our survey of the Old Testament, I talk to students, and we get into the issue of science and the Bible, and especially with the question of evolution. It's a big question our students come in with. And I always wrap up this section of the course when the students, they have three choices. They can assume that this theory of evolution is a process by which the world came into existence without any intervention of any divine being. Basically, a purely philosophical naturalistic approach. Or they can assume that evolution is, macroevolution has been demonstrated, and it's a tool that God uses to develop the world and set it up. Or they can assume that evolution is not scientifically provable, but that God has created by some other means. And I would tell the students that if they go with 2 or 3, they can be mature, growing believers, Christians. But if they leave God out of the equation, they've got a real problem. In other words, if they take views 2 or 3, I don't have a problem with that. If they take view number 1, they've got a real problem, because they're assuming everything just came about as a natural process, and there's no God, therefore there's no accountability.
I think that certainty is our agenda, not the Bible's. One of the things you consistently see all through the Bible is God works through and for flawed, imperfect creatures. And given that the Bible again and again and again shows us communities dependent on human testimony from human people who don't always get it right, why we should think that the Bible itself is an exception to the rule of how it shows God work. It seemed, I love the Catholic way of putting it, which is that the Bible is sufficient, adequate for salvation. It can do the job. I know it can do the job. I've heard the testimonies from so many students. That's different than demanding that it be perfect according to a definition that we ourselves have cooked up in a society that values factuality. And it really helped me to study church history and find out that lots of ancient writers assumed that not everything here was fact.
Yeah, in fact, let me just add that. I mean, on the one hand, I think that attributing divine attributes to a text that very clearly has human authorship woven into it, sometimes the authors even say who they are. I mean, potentially that's idolatry, right? I mean, if we want to put a name to the sin that's behind young earth creationism and those kinds of movements. On the other hand, I don't think that that means we have to have radical distrust, right? I mean, if it's just like any other testimony where someone says, hey, I had this incredible life-changing religious experience, want to try it? You know, I believe I encountered God, want to meet him, her. If it's human testimony, that doesn't mean that it's either has to be completely wrong, complete garbage, or the inerrant, divine word which can't have any errors about science or about theology or about anything. It could be human testimony that invites us to experience the truth for ourselves. And I think that's an option that is often excluded by that sort of polar opposite approach to things that we encounter in Protestant fundamentalism.
A brief story. An advisee came to my office to get a drop slip signed, and trying to be a good advisor, I said, how's your first semester at seminary going? And he got this very funny look, and I said, yeah. Well, he said, it's going pretty well except for your class. He was taking Intro to Old Testament with me. And I said, well, you don't have to I'm trying really hard to be non-threatening. You don't have to answer this question, but I'd be interested if you could talk about that. And he said, well, where I come from, we honor and respect the Bible as God's Word, and we don't go digging into exactly what it says the way you do. And on the one hand, my heart just wanted to break for him because I knew what he was saying. I mean, there were things that had brought him to seminary that were so precious to him. And on the other hand, that sense that he so needed the Bible to be one thing that it was threatening to look at exactly what it said kind of signaled there might be an issue there. His story turned out happily. He came to terms with it. But.
Yeah. I think that the Bible, as I've studied it and as I've grown and have had more experience with reading Scripture, I found that there's a lot more there than what I understood or anticipated or even thought could be possible when I was growing up in a pretty conservative situation. And I found in my experience that I found that reading the Bible and taking it seriously and sort of letting myself be a servant of the text rather than being the master of the text and controlling it has been, I think, really instrumental in my own sort of spiritual growth and development. So I agree with a lot of what that's saying.
Well, this has been a great opportunity to get together, get you four together. All four of these people are gifted scholars and teachers. I hope that you in the audience appreciate that what they have brought to the table tonight. Let's show our appreciation to them. Thanks for coming. There should be some cookies and coffee outside, so keep the conversation going. Thank you.